my prof went to Australia. And when he went to Australia, he said, hey, why don't you teach for a year and then you can go back and be rich. So I said, sounds like a deal. So I stayed back in Canada and taught for a year. And I was a young fellow, 23, 24 years old. And it turned out that I was a very good teacher. I got voted as the best prof. And so at that point, I decided that I was going to be a professor for the rest of my life. But then you cannot be a professor without a PhD. So I said, well, let me get my PhD and then go back to India. So I came home for a visit after 3 years in Canada and then went back and got my PhD. But just as I was finishing up my PhD, there was this gentleman, Peter Brackett, who used to work for a startup company in Toronto. And this particular company had a very good technology. Those days, it used to be very hard to send anything more than 300 bits per second on a telephone line. And this company had really figured out how to do 9,600 bits per second on a telephone line. So it was sort of magical. But the company was not doing that well financially, so he had to quit the company as the head of engineering, and he came to teach at Queen's University where I was doing my PhD. And what happened was that Motorola came and bought that little struggling company in Toronto, and when they bought the company, they asked Peter Brackett to sort of come back and head the engineering again. And after he joined that company, about 3 months later, I got my PhD. So Peter called me up and said, hey, forget all this teaching and research. Why don't you just come to this and join me here? It's a lot of fun. And because I knew Peter and I really liked Peter, I landed up going to Toronto. And then over the next 4 years, this company, even though it was part of Motorola, a young company, we went from 20 people to 400 people, $100 million business, very, very profitable, very nice ramp. So, and then I got married to Jaishree in 1980. So in 84, when we looked back, it was 3 of us who actually built that whole company. And so we said, well, it would be a lot of fun if we can build this on our own. But then those days, there wasn't much of venture capital. There was only 2 places in the world which sort of had the venture capital, California and Boston. So we decided to move to Boston. And so we moved through intercompany transfer. So it was a Motorola Toronto to Motorola Boston. So we moved out in 1984. And it was pretty naive to think that a young couple can just move into a brand new city and start companies, right? But the lesson here is that, as you meander through life, what happens is that doors open for you mostly because of the people that you meet, mostly because of the excellent people that you work with. So an opportunity to work with great people is everything in life. Because I think the hardest thing in life is to know what's possible. And people, when you work with excellent people, they tell you what's possible. And once you get that benchmark, it's not that hard to actually achieve that benchmark. But knowing what's possible is the hardest thing in life. So anytime you get an opportunity to actually work with great people, don't ever miss that opportunity. Don't worry about the reward. Don't worry about how much you get out of it or any of those things, because the possibility of knowing what's possible is everything in life. And then we moved to Boston, and then I worked for Motorola for 3 more years to get my green card, immigration, all that kind of stuff, and then left and then started a first company called Coral Networks, and then Cascade Communications, and then Sycamore Networks, and so on. And then in year 2000, I sort of said, instead of my being the entrepreneur, I want to somehow create the same opportunity for lots of other people. And so we did a bunch of things, and maybe I can talk a little bit about that, and then after that, it's going to be mostly questions and answers. So be ready with lots of good questions. So what I did was so we set up our foundation in 1994, and then we used to work with IIT Madras and so on. And the first sort of big initiative we did was in MIT. I joined the MIT board in year 2000. And most of the companies that we did in 70s and 80s in Boston, the core technology for those companies actually came out of places like Bell Labs and IBM. But by year 2000, Bell Labs and IBM were dead because there was no more monopoly anymore. And the global competition meant that companies couldn't really do research. So the center of gravity for idea generation had clearly moved back to universities. And in the United States, they spend about $150 billion a year doing research, about $100 billion in federal labs, and about $50 billion in universities. So the thing that we wanted to look at was how can you make that money that the government taxpayers spend in universities create bigger opportunities for the entrepreneurs, right? So we started this Center for Deshpande Center for Technological Innovation in MIT. And the idea behind the center is pretty simple. It's innovation plus relevance is equal to impact. That is, if people come up with all kinds of great ideas, those great ideas don't really have an impact unless they're directed to some burning problem in the world. Because anytime you cannot mandate innovation, so to create innovation, you have to create a nurturing environment. But when you create a nurturing environment, it becomes a community of its own. And even though, so let's say a professor at MIT, and within MIT, out of the 1,000 faculty, there's about probably 50 of them who are more Nobel Prize kind of guys who are really driven by the beauty of the idea itself, and you need to leave those guys alone. But the rest of the 95% of the people, every time they get an idea, they're motivated by impact. They want to cure cancer, they want to create clean water, clean air, clean energy, whatever. But then, when they have a great idea, if you go talk to the same group, the faculty and the graduate students 2 months from now, they'll have 10 more ideas, right? Because that's their business. Their business is coming up with lots of great ideas. So the question then is, how do you help them pick and choose which of these 10 ideas to pursue so that the idea will have the biggest impact in the world? Now, left to themselves, what happens is that even though they all have a desire for impact, they'll land up picking an idea which impresses each other rather than the impact, right? Because that's a very natural thing to happen because you live in a community, and so you want to do things that reward you, that sort of your colleagues appreciate, and so on. And so anytime you have a think tank, a nurturing environment, a research environment, if you really want to create an impact with their ideas, you have to have a very conscious way of connecting those thinkers to doers, thinkers to relevance. And so that was sort of the primary thrust behind this Deshpande Center. And over the last 10 years, we have looked at maybe 500 different projects, funded about 90 of them, about 30 of them have become companies. So now that's sort of become a national model. I co-chair a council for Obama, and that process has become a national process for National Science Foundation and so on. So that was sort of the way of making technological innovation have a bigger impact on the world. But what's even more interesting was a project that Jaishree and I started in India about 8 years ago. 8 years ago, we said, we want to do something in India, but we want to do social innovation, not so much technological innovation. For social innovation, that equation gets turned around. It's really relevance plus innovation is equal to impact. Meaning, for social innovation, you really have to start with a deep understanding of the problem itself, and then you bring in whatever new idea that you need to solve the problem. The new idea that you actually bring to the solution does not have to be patentable, first time in the world, huge competitive advantage, or anything like that. It's really a deep understanding of the problem itself. So to implement this program, we came up with an idea called Social Innovation Sandbox. So we took about 5 districts around Hubli, Dharwar in Karnataka. That's where Jaishree grew up, and my parents sort of lived there. And so right based on that Hubli, Dharwar, which is a tier 2 city, we took about 5 districts, which is large enough to have enough villages and arid land, irrigated land, and enough of diversity of all kinds of issues, but small enough to create a critical mass. And it's a little bit like trying to recreate a Silicon Valley for social entrepreneurship. And so over the last 8 years, we've had over maybe 100 young men and women from US, Canada, Italy, all kinds of different places come and spend time in Hubli, in the sandbox, injecting new ideas and so on. But very quickly, we realized that you cannot have social innovation unless you have local leadership. So we created a lot of local leadership programs. For example, we have a program where 4 college kids come together, pick a problem in the society and solve it, right? So today we have 10,000 students doing 2,500 projects. So it's really massively critical, where a lot of these youngsters are running around and really sort of looking at the society and certainly having this mindset that, every time you see a lot of times people walk around the society not even noticing the problems. Next step is to actually see the problems. And then the third step is actually become passionate about some problem and find a solution to it. Every problem exists because it's deadlocked. The problem cannot be solved because of whatever reasons. And entrepreneurship is all about finding a way to unlock that knot, right? And so what we find is that it doesn't matter whether that problem is small or big. When people actually get that experiential opportunity to experience that thing about seeing a problem and actually solving it, it's a very empowering feeling. Suddenly, instead of becoming a passive person who just sits around and complains, you actually become a person who says, hey, this is an opportunity, I can do something about it. So the whole mindset changes. In fact, the t-shirt that all these 10,000 people wear, on the back it says, complaints start with they, solutions start with I, right? So we have 10,000 of these people running around, and then we have a program to train young men and women to be social entrepreneurs. A lot of them come from rural areas and so on. So that's been a very successful program. And then we're working with about 50 social interventions. But we do these social interventions, we work with them the same way you would do a company, right? First you say, tell me what is it that you're doing that's new? And then you try to really refine that, whatever that newness is, the innovation is, and then we fund that innovation. May work, may not work. And if it doesn't work, that's fine, you try something else. But if it works, you have to be prepared to scale it the same way you scale companies, right? So out of the 50, quite a few of the programs within the last 8 years have scaled quite a bit. How many of you know Akshay Patra? Okay, so you know Akshay Patra. Akshay Patra, their biggest kitchen is built in Hubli, in the sandbox. And so in that kitchen, they make 172,000 meals every day, right? It's 6 rupees a meal, 12 cents a meal. And they serve this hot meal to government school children. So it's local cuisine, local produce, food that children really love. It's a part of the government program, because government has a program to feed midday meal programs. So they give about $15 a year is the budget that the government has to feed the children. It costs us about $30. So we raise that other $15, both in India and US and so on, to fund that program. And so far we've been scaling it, and today we're at 1.3 million meals every day, right? And so Akshay Patra is really scaled, and now there's, the goal is to get to 5 million children by 2020, and then somehow spread that practice of using good technology, good food safety standards and everything else to all the 120 million children in India that go to school. Another program that has scaled is Agastya. How many of you know Agastya? Okay, a few of you. So Agastya is a program which teaches science to rural children. So what they do is they get a van, and in the van they put 150 experiments, and then they go to the village and they teach. So the way the sandbox works is these people sort of say, well, I have this program and I want to debug it, I want to develop it. So we funded about 200,000 children a year for 4 years. And what we found in those 4 years is that didn't matter which village you went to, small or big, there would always be 5 to 10 children who are very smart. And so they came up with a program called the Young Instructor Leader Program, where they identify these smart children, bring them out in the summertime, teach them some science. Now they become the science ambassadors in the schools. So when they send the experiments, and now they have this lab in a box, and they have experiments on the scooter and mobile van, all that kind of stuff. But when the experiment goes to the school, suddenly these ambassadors become the peer teachers. So they create a huge amount of excitement within the school, and all the teachers get all excited. And so a couple of weeks ago, when we had the science fair in Hubli, there were 15,000 students who showed up. And not only the students, certainly the teachers. There were 500 teachers who showed up to the science fair and so on. So it's a massively exciting program. And the best part was last year, out of the 10 Intel Science Award winners in India, 3 of the teams were from these villages, And this year there's a new global competition called the Change Makers globally, right? Or in that 100 globally competitive teams, 12 of the teams were from these villages, So I think the idea here is that if you just give an opportunity for these people who haven't had the opportunities, it's amazing how they shine. But the new thing is to really bring that execution excellence. What happens is, when you have a for-profit company and a non-profit company, an entrepreneur has to be pretty crazy to start anything new because it's always odds are against you. The non-profit, similarly, it's very hard to start a non-profit organization because you don't have resources and everything else. But in the for-profit, what happens is over the course of time, the entrepreneur somehow has to find a solution or a product for which somebody is willing to pay. If you don't find that sweet spot, you're out of business, right? So in the for-profit, what happens is that anything that does not stick gets flushed out. So most of the assets are sort of performing assets. So, sometimes it's true that in the for-profit organizations, people can lose their way and do things that are not necessarily great for the world and the society, but they have to execute every day. If you don't serve good food in a restaurant, you shut down after 3-4 weeks. So execution excellence is absolutely given in the for-profit sector. In the non-profit sector, compassion is absolutely given. Because without compassion, nobody would go through all this effort of actually setting up non-profit and trying to do good to the world and everything else. But at the same time, in the non-profit world, unfortunately, the beneficiaries that you serve don't have the purchasing power most of the time. And therefore, what happens is that so you don't really have a feedback loop to know whether what you're doing is right or wrong. So the non-profits have to please the donors more than they do have to please the beneficiaries. So as a result of that, this is not a competitive market, and therefore the execution is not necessarily given. So what we're trying to do is to bring the execution excellence of the for-profit to the compassion of the non-profit, and to bring the compassion of the non-profit to the execution excellence of the for-profit. So if you can make businesses compassionate, and if you can make the non-profits really execute, I think you really create a world that can work. So we have about 50 of these programs, and we have a program where these are not programs that we dictate. So the approach is not an area development program where you go study the whole area and say, I think these are the differences we need to make this thing better. It's a little bit more like a venture capital model where we say, is there a team of people who can actually take on a cause and do something with it? And so, for example, helping farmers grow rice. A lot of the people in India, they plant the rice this far apart, and it was proven about 35 years ago that if you plant this far apart, it takes 1/3 the seed, 1/3 the water, and you get 20 to 40% more yield. It's called the SRI technique. So first year we did 80 farmers, then 300, 1,200, this year 10,000. So what happens is that you take these simple things which can add a huge amount of value and just keep scaling them. And so that social innovation sandbox model really worked in India. And then we realized that actually US needs as much social innovation as India needs. And so we have a social innovation sandbox in US, and then we have one in Canada. So been experimenting quite a bit with both the for-profit entrepreneurship and the social sector. And so it's been a lot of fun, and I think I saw a lot of hands go up in terms of the people who actually want to be entrepreneurs. I think in terms of technology, the country faces a lot of challenges, and a lot of these challenges actually have solutions, right? I mean, either simple solutions or technical solutions, and I think the opportunity is yours. In fact, if you look at the waves of the opportunities, the 80s, 90s, and last 25, 30 years, a lot of the high tech in India is built around services model, where India does a lot of work and does it very nicely, but it's mostly benefiting the other companies in the other countries, right? It's work being done in rupee and the services being sold in dollar economy, which is nothing wrong. And as a result of that, it's created a huge amount of technical talent and capabilities and management skills and financial skills and everything else. The next big wave of opportunities in India is going to be people like you actually using the technology to solve the problems right in India and prove the markets here and then take those products global, right? Because that's a great opportunity. I mean, engineers and entrepreneurs can only react to customers when they actually can see the customers every day. So those of you who are interested in entrepreneurial opportunities, I think there's going to be lots of things. You know, for entrepreneurs, every problem is an opportunity. And the good thing in India is there's no lack of problems, right? You turn around, everywhere there's a problem. So there's no lack of opportunities for entrepreneurs who want to be entrepreneurs in India. So with those comments, why don't I open the floor for any questions, comments that you may have. So, yeah.
Thanks a lot for your opening remarks. I found one of your comments interesting. You're talking about businesses being compassionate. Can you talk a little more about that? Maybe give us an example so that we can relate to what you're saying.
Oh, well, you know, I think the capitalistic system, you know, about 20, 30 years ago, it sort of appeared like the capitalistic system won, all the communist social things lost, and so on. The capitalistic system works best if you can actually price everything that's valuable in life, which you cannot, you know. So right now, for example, clean air is free, water is free, right? I mean, a lot of these things that are really, really valuable in the world are not priced. And so what happens is the businesses, they tend to exploit it as much as they can to their advantage. So because the top line and the bottom line is what drives businesses. So in the process, you could be using the natural resources, you could be doing things that are not really good for the whole world, but they're optimized locally for that particular part of the business. And so I think businesses, for their long-term survival, if they can think of the good of the whole society, it's a better thing to do. So it's very easy to get lost. So you could have a big top line and a bottom line, but you may totally miss out on really being useful in the long term. So sustainability is a big issue right now. So.
Where do you draw your vision when you are funding these companies? Do you fund them, say, to improve the lifestyle, or is it just solving the bare needs of the people? Or is it like MDG goals?
Well, you know, I think you probably heard this expression that you would always fund an A team with a B idea rather than a B team with an A idea. So I think whenever you fund companies, you're actually funding people. And so which is a good team? A team is a good team if it's really passionate about what they want to do, and if they have an open mind, and if they work together. So it's really funding a team as opposed to the idea itself. The idea usually sort of, you know, I've not seen too many companies, either my own or other people's, where you start with an idea, and if you look at the idea a year from now, 2 years from now, that it's the same thing, you know, because as you get into implementing the company, there is so much more valuable information that you sort of pivot and you navigate your way through. So I think you really need a team that's good as opposed to an idea that's fixed. Yes.
You have mentioned that the younger generation, in these days are very confident now. Huh?
What's that?
Younger generation,
yes.
Younger people are very confident, very nice. and some changes are taking place in our country as well. But still, if you see with the technological giants like IITs and so much of skills we have in our country, but still our country has not produced world leaders. Even we have almost 6 decades past independence, but still we have not produced world leaders. What could be due to? Can you tell me about that?
Well, I mean, Mahatma Gandhi was the biggest leader that the country produced.
Yes,
so,
one or two, but not.
well, I mean, in terms of, if you mean world leaders in terms of business and so on, I think it just takes time. I think it's all a question of aspiration. And the aspiration, first time when you do something, you're so happy when some little good thing happens to you, you can't even believe that good thing is happening to you. And so you need a lot of role models, you need a lot of, in some ways it's a long time, in some ways it's not that long a time in terms of the country. If you look at the history of the country, that after the people have the freedom to actually, because entrepreneurship is really all about having that confidence in yourself and having the ability to think freely and do things. And that's something new to the country, because entrepreneurship also means that you are willing to fail, because entrepreneurship is all about experimentation, right? I mean, you have a deep desire to change something, you have a conviction. That conviction doesn't mean that it'll always work. A lot of times it may fail. And so just developing that culture within the country of where it's okay to fail, it takes a certain amount of time. And also it takes a certain amount of time to the policies. For example, in India, if you fail, if you start a company and if you fail, just to shut that company, it's a nightmare in India right now. So, all the rules are not quite there yet to sort of really facilitate this entrepreneurial ecosystem. Even though, in spite of all that, there is still a lot of entrepreneurial activity going on in India. So I think it just takes time before the society and the individuals mature. And it's it's a little different than America, in the sense in America, it was a wide open country and people just came in. And so everything was brand new for them. So the rules were not there. They could do anything they wanted. And when people get dislocated like that, it's a lot easier to be entrepreneurs. Yeah, that's why you see a lot of Indian entrepreneurs in US, because when you get dislocated, thinking out of the box is easy. South Indians going to North, they become better entrepreneurs actually. North Indians coming to South become better entrepreneurs. So dislocation, mobility, a culture where failure is not penalized, those are all important things, and they take time for that culture to develop. But I think it's 10 times more than it used to be when we were all growing up and when we were young.
Hi, very nice talk. Just had one quick question. So you say one question about high-tech entrepreneurship in India, right? When we do research, we find that every piece of equipment that we need, we are still waiting for somebody to send it to us, right? So this is really a tough thing to get over. I don't see in the long term how long it's going to take for us to even get to the point where we get something quickly, and if I get something 6 months later, my idea is dead. It's long gone. So this is a bit of a problem. And there's also a lot of structural hindrances to actually progressing in terms of funding. And so what is your take on how this is going to move forward? To be honest, on the inside, I find myself being very pessimistic about these things, okay? Because it really hurts. I mean, when you see somebody else, for example, I not to be very personal about this, we had a proposal for funding which we wrote 2 years back, and we're still waiting on it. And this summer I saw somebody publish on the same idea. So it's very hard. I mean, when somebody says, we are going to do all these things, we are confident people, all these things is very nice to hear. But the ground reality is somewhat different, right? So I would like to hear your take on that.
Well, I think if you're trying to do leading edge research and compete with MIT and Stanford and Caltech, I think it's rough, right? Because you're not going to get there. So somehow my belief is that every human being, every organization, every society is optimally suited to do certain contextual innovation, right? So if there's a way you can really understand what is the context and where is it that you have the unique strength, then you can shine and you can almost become the best in the world in that particular part of it. For example, MIT is a powerhouse of innovation, right? But if I ask MIT to solve the Akshay Patra problem, they'll screw it up royally. They'll probably come up with $5 a meal, and they won't even realize that it's $4.88 too expensive, right? So they're not well suited to solve the problem. So in some ways, I think if, entrepreneurs always start not by saying what you don't have, but what do you have, right? And then within the tools that you have, what do we have? Then you say, how can I make a difference? And so I think if all of us can somehow, that doesn't mean that you don't, I think it's a question of whether you are in the position to make policies or whether you are sort of the entrepreneur, performer, researcher kind of a thing. If you're an entrepreneur, performer, researcher kind of a thing, you have the system that you have, right? You cannot just wishfully hope that it's going to be something different because it won't. And so within that system, you have to do the best you can. And we know some people do a lot better than others, right? If you're a policymaker, then your job is to reduce a lot of that friction for people who are actually trying to do things. So as a policymaker, I would definitely recommend that India spend more money on research and development, which they are. In fact, this whole day I had reviews. I heard professors getting 26 crores for some research and so on, which is pretty nice. It's getting there, but it's not quite where it needs to be. But within the context of your research, if there is a way you can contextualize your research to the problems that this society needs to solve and come up with solutions. So where is India excelling? It's excelling in low-cost, affordable solutions that scale, right? Because that's the need of the country. It's because the affordability is low, and it's 1.2 billion. So anything you can do to come up with solutions and research and ideas that drive that low-cost solutions that scale, I think will be world-class. Whereas if you went the other way around, you're going to lose because you'll never have the infrastructure to actually compete. So it's a question of, in fact, I can tell you, the universities need to invent, innovate, and then train people who are entrepreneurial who can do something with it. So within, there'll be some C.V. Ramans and C.N.R. Raos who probably work on that end of the spectrum. But there's lots of opportunities where you can take great ideas that already are a little bit more mature that you can actually apply to things. In fact, in US, the same thing happens. In fact, just a few weeks before I left Boston, there's a guy by the name Kripa Varanasi, who was actually IIT Madras graduate. He came to MIT, got his bachelor's, got his master's, PhD, worked in GE for a while, and then he came back to MIT as a professor. He is working on this nanotechnology, not the core nanotechnology, but he's come up with a thing where he can coat this thing to make things very dry. For example, the driest things that you can find in the world, I believe, are lotus leaves and butterfly wings, because they have the ability to stay dry, because if they get wet, then they can't fly. So he came up with this thing where he can make the surface 40% more dry than these things that are available in the nature. And initially he was thinking of applying this to, there's lots of applications, like, for example, icing the planes, so the ice doesn't stay, or improving the turbine efficiency and a whole bunch of stuff. But finally, his students actually started a company recently which they applied to ketchup bottles. A lot of you probably have this experience of trying to get the ketchup out of the bottle. It never comes out. So these guys, they came up with that same nanotechnology liquid that they spray inside the bottle, and when you pour the ketchup, it just 100% comes out of it, right? So they actually have a royalty deal where they get 2 cents for every bottle. And so, it's like instead of starting with something very complex, they took that very complex technology and applied it to something very simple and get going, and then slowly they can then work upwards. So I think finding a context in which your ideas can be useful so that it can bootstrap your way is probably one idea that that I think would be useful to you. How about some students? How about some Sharavati people?
I have the mic, and can I
Okay.
go? Not Sharavati. Yeah. My question is on, when you talk about social innovation, most times you do want to measure the impact of social innovation. And one of the frameworks I'd like to define is you could do it bottom up or you could do it top down. When I say bottom up, maybe examples could be you could have your own, it's a social enterprise, you start off with a district, you make a difference, you can touch and feel, you can measure the influence, right? And probably it's very fulfilling as well. The top-down approach is more about policy, frameworks, and I think in that context, you cannot ignore the government, right? For a lot of people in this room, government has always been, how do I call it? There's this Lakshman Rekha, so to speak, right? So has there been any experience that you've had from the companies or the programs that you've funded where you've been able to cross this line and it's still been successful?
Yeah, actually, last 4 years or so, I do go to Washington every quarter because I'm a part of that Obama Council. So I've had some exposure to Washington, and I've spent some time in Delhi. In fact, I and Sam Pitroda just hosted a conference a few weeks ago. So the insight that I have in that particular topic is whether it's Delhi think tanks or the Brookings in Washington, these are very smart people. They have all kinds of data, all kinds of information, everything else, but they have no conviction. That is, they've never gotten out of Washington or Delhi. But they're making policies for everybody, including rural villages, everything else. And they're so smart that they can fit the curve to anything that you want. And they can argue their way too. So they'll always win. So, but then, on the other hand, if you go and talk to the people who are actually working in the field, usually people who are very entrepreneurial, bottoms-up do things, they don't have if you go and say, what should I do? They're very confident. They'll say, of course you should do X. You say, why? They'll say, well, works for me, right? Because these people who work bottoms-up don't have a concept of policy. And policy always means something that works for most and not everybody. And so the idea that I've been trying to preach, both Washington and Delhi, is to do policy by proof of concept. So let's use the philanthropic dollars to experiment with lots of things. And if it works in one place, let's do it in 2, then 4, then 8. And then at some point, it becomes so obvious that then we need to put the big weight to actually embrace that. That is, if you have to come up with new solutions, innovation. So again, if you look at the sort of the for-profit model, what happens is it's the angel investors and the venture capitalists who actually put money into experimenting. Most of the experiments fail. Most of the startups fail. But there'll be a few that come up, and some get very large. But most of the time, the bigger companies know that they cannot innovate. So they have a mergers and acquisitions group that actually acquire these good ideas. And that's how they innovate. So the big companies typically innovate by M&A, mergers and acquisitions. The government is bigger than the biggest company you can ever think of. And therefore, the government shouldn't even try to innovate because they cannot. And therefore, the government needs an M&A, a mergers and acquisition group. And so if they can articulate the problems they're trying to solve, and then if they can look for solutions that people are coming up with, and then slowly scale them, and then make it a part of the policy, I think it's a good way to get there. So in US, the National Science Foundation embracing this way we came with at MIT and now applying to $7.4 billion research is an example of that. Akshay Patra in India would be an example of that. Agastya would be an example of that because they're all funded by the government right now. And so the government funds 60% of the Akshay Patra program for 1.3 million children. But then a lot of the conversation now is, how can you take this model and find different ways to apply it to all the 120 million children, right? So I think if you find the right people in the government, you can work with them. But it's difficult. It's a different, it's a difficult culture, and corporations took a long time to really understand how to do the M&A. And even when they do M&A, a lot of times when they buy the companies, it doesn't work either, right? Because the cultural differences and so on. So, but I think I really like this idea of policy by proof of concept. But any intervention that we get involved with, we're trying to make sure that if it's successful, it can become a part of the policy. Because that's the only way you can solve large-scale problems. Otherwise, you'll be nibbling at the heels. You could always start one school and serve a few people here and so on, but it'll never be a big part of the solution. So.
Like you mentioned, you were the first generation entrepreneur when you started, and most of the hands that were raised will also be a first generation entrepreneur. What are the challenges that you faced as a first generation entrepreneur? And can I ask second question also?
Yes.
How do you overcome the fear of failure?
Well, actually there's no challenges, right? Entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurship is all about really finding your passion and really wanting to do it. But whatever that is you want to do, certain things are absolutely true. It's always going to be harder than you think. It's going to take longer than you think, and it's going to take more money than you think. So once you start, there's nothing but trouble. But to get through that, that's where you need the perseverance and also the passion. If that's what you want to do, then you don't feel like a failure. You don't feel like it's hard work. It doesn't feel like it's a sacrifice. If you think that you're going to give up everything in life to become an entrepreneur and do something really hard for 3, 4, 5 years, become successful and happily live ever after, some cases, people get through that little window and somehow they become successful. But in most of the cases, you'll fail. Because I think if you think it's just a short-term thing where you can do something and you can get by, it doesn't work because it's just a long-term thing. The other thing is, I think whatever you try to do, make sure that the idea is simple. Because in life, simple things are very hard to do. Hard things are almost impossible to do. And so every time you have an idea that's very complex, that's why professors don't make good entrepreneurs. Because unfortunately for them to impress their colleagues, they always have to think complexity. Because if you say something very simple, why would they actually give you a professorship, right? So I think doing simple things that have a huge amount of value to somebody is sort of the secret of that thing. But I've never felt like I've sacrificed or given up a lot. First company when we started, those days when I started company in US, venture capital was like a new thing. A venture capitalist would have maybe $20, $30 million. That would be like the whole fund. So for them to actually write a check to this stranger for $1 million, $2 million was like a big thing. And so one of the things those days was that they never funded you unless you went without a salary at least for 1 year. That was sort of the rule. So I and Jaishree, we saved a lot of money, and Jaishree used to work. I gave up my job, and then we had 2 little kids, and so it was a very complex life. But after a year, we actually got funded. But then we raised that money, and then within 3 months from that first company where we started, we had, I and my partner had a difference of opinion in terms of how we run the company. And so one day, after 3 months, I was going to work. I stopped at the gas station. I called Jaishree, and because as soon as I got funded, Jaishree left her job because we had a very complex 3-year-old, 5-year-old, and dropping them out 5 a.m. in the morning, picking them up at 6 p.m., all that kind of stuff. So she quit her job because I was in the payroll. We raised money. And then I called her up at home and said, I don't think this is going to work, so I'm going to quit today. And so she said, well, do what you need to do. And so I actually went to the office and said, Frank, we don't agree. And he was more a senior guy, I was the young guy. So I said, it's like if I have to hang around telling you that it's not going to work, it's not a good thing. And that's another lesson. When you can't have two cooks in the kitchen who don't agree on the recipe, right? So if you don't agree with something, and if it's not a situation that you control, then I think you just have to have the guts to get out. And so I said, why don't you do what you think you need to do, and wish you all the best. And he was happy, so I just quit. And when you quit these little companies, it's not like you have a severance and all that kind of stuff, right? You just walk out. And we had just used up all our savings. So I and Jaishree, we were in this strange country, and we just had enough money for half a month or something like that. And so when you look back, it looks very hard. But when I was going through it, it never felt like it was anything unusual or anything difficult, because I couldn't believe that I actually had the opportunities to do these startups and do companies. And over the next 6 months, I got seed funded. I did Cascade, which became successful, and so on. So somehow, I think when you do things in life, if you feel like you're sacrificing a lot, it's probably not the right thing to do. I think you really want to enjoy whatever it is that you're doing. And I always felt that I'm so fortunate to actually get to do these things. And so, and I think, so that's necessary. Otherwise, it's very hard to, get through all those hurdles that you actually have to get through. And somehow entrepreneurs are I think they love misery. Because, if you make it somewhat simpler for them, then they'll make it even harder for themselves, right? Your benchmark goes up. And so you're always working on that edge of where you're trying to do things which could fail. And failure doesn't become as daunting. So that first failure that I had, what it does is that once you fail, your comfort zone broadens tremendously, right? I grew up in a very sort of a middle class, protected family. So for me, coming home at 11 o'clock or something like that would be like a big, dangerous kind of a thing. And so when you go through a lot of these experiences, suddenly your comfort zone broadens quite a bit. And then what happens is things don't look risky anymore, and they don't look like failures. And that's why you'll always see that people who have done something bigger, they'll always talk about this near-death experience they went through. And we all do. And those near-death experiences are what actually broaden your horizon in terms of your comfort zone. Yeah.
Most of us, as soon as we graduate from here, will be like clueless about entrepreneurship, and that's why we don't take up that step. So which direction would you suggest or recommend, either PhD or an MBA, or we take up a job? So what would you suggest that we should take up? And after that, when do we know that we have to make the shift from doing what we're doing to taking up entrepreneurship?
Okay. So, number one, if anytime anybody comes to me and says, I have this great idea, do you think I should be an entrepreneur? What do you think my answer is? No, right? Because I think for you to be an entrepreneur and to be successful, your conviction has to be so strong that you're not going to ask for anybody else's approval, right? Because it's going to take that level of conviction for you to actually persevere through. Because most of the people, almost all your well-wishers, will all tell you not to do it. Not because they mean bad to you, but because they hate to see people suffer, right? They hate to people get hurt. And in fact, when the first thing goes wrong in your whatever the venture you're trying to do, everybody will say, I told you so. I told you not to do it, right? So for you to actually get through all those hurdles, you have to have such a strong conviction that you're not looking for anybody else to endorse your idea or do it. That conviction doesn't mean it's right. You could still fail. But if you don't have that conviction, I can guarantee you'll fail. Because the first time you hit the roadblock, you'll be out, right? So people right after graduation, whether you should start a company or not, I think it just depends on how strongly you feel and how good your idea is and how great the opportunity is and so on. In most of the cases, I would say do whatever you want to do. You would do MBA, do PhD, go work for somebody. But in every case, always look for an opportunity where you can make a big difference. If you do a PhD, do some great work. If you go work for somebody, do something, come up with a great product, make a lot of money for them. Because the track record that you build for yourself of making that difference is what builds your own confidence in terms of being able to do something on your own. I think how many of you know what a balance sheet is? You all know what a balance sheet is, right? You have assets and liabilities. And so everybody, sometimes you work for companies and they have balance sheets, but each one of you have a balance sheet of your own, your personal balance sheet. And you are the CEO of your own life. And what you carry, the assets in your own balance sheet, is your ability to make a difference. You see people sometimes who can just walk into a room and make a big difference to what people are trying to do, right? That's an asset. And that's an asset that you want to develop in your career. As you develop that asset and you have the ability to walk into a situation and make a difference, take charge, that asset will be hugely rewarded. And so I think whatever you do, make sure that you have that opportunity to build that track record for yourself. So, 5 o'clock? One? Okay.
So you said whenever if you are having a difference in opinion than your co-founder, it's generally hard to get along far, and it's better to quit what you did. But I have a different experience. I started a company, and for last 7-8 months, almost for every matter, at least 70-80%, I have a different view than what my co-founder thinks, and we quarrel, sometimes very heated discussion, and that eventually leads to a better decision. Or if at all we don't manage to settle at one decision, the one who is an expert in that area, we lead it to him as the final authority. So do you think it's a different?
No. It's a very good comment. I think teamwork is different than not agreeing on something. Brainstorming different ideas and trying to come up with the best idea is a good thing. But sometimes you just have very fundamental disagreements on something. And so if, for example, the difference of opinion we had in this case was we were trying to build a product. Cisco at that time was maybe $3-4 million a year program, a company, very small company. And so we had a technology where we could do a lot of this routing, everything else in the silicon, and we could do 10 times better than Cisco. But as we started implementing, it turned out that 5 times was a piece of cake, 8 times was doable, 10 was really hard, right? But my senior other partner, Frank Bruns, he was a little bit more of a technical macho. He kept saying, no, we have to crack the 10x. And my simplistic approach was, 5 times is more than enough, let's get it out there. But he would not give in. And so we were at like usually the difficulty curves are like that. And so it wasn't a question of, brainstorming different ways and coming up with this thing. And he was very strong in that particular position. And I tried hard. It wasn't like I just walked out first time. We went through the first meeting, second meeting, third meeting, every 2 weeks. We would come to the same conclusion. And he would hold his line and say, hey, that's the way I'm going to do it. And unfortunately, but I think the lesson is, it doesn't matter whether it's a relationship or a situation, whatever you are in, there are things that you control and there are things that you don't control. If you disagree on things that you don't control, then you don't really have that much option other than to quit and do something else. And quitting is a good option because otherwise you lose an opportunity. That's very different than having a group of people where you're brainstorming and you may agree and debate and so on, but at the end of it, you both agree on an approach. That is, you convince each other that A is better than B, and so let's all do A. So there's no disagreement that A is what you both want to do. But if you think A is the right thing and the other guy thinks it's the B, and it's a very fundamentally different thing, then I think it's better to get out than hang in there, because you don't want to be the negative force being in that organization and saying, I told you it's not going to work. I told you it's not going to work, right? And then it becomes a very negative kind of a dynamic. So,
on that context, I think you had that to do this after 3 months since you started the venture. Say after 2-3 years, I realized that, and then I think quitting is a good option. Then how hard is it to, like, you have invested your 3-4 years?
yeah, but you'll waste another 10 years. So I think cutting losses at any given time is a good thing. Actually, that's the secret of failing. Whenever you fail, you want to fail small, right? And not accepting the failure is what gets companies into trouble, gets individuals into trouble. So, a lot of times people think that companies are made by these big decisions, at board meeting, everything else. That's not the case. You make, particularly if you're a young company moving fast, you make, let's say, 10 decisions a week, a lot of decisions, and you get 5 right and 5 wrong. When you're making a decision, you may never make a wrong decision, right? Why would you? You don't. But a decision becomes obvious whether it's right or wrong sometime later, 2 weeks later, a month later. But when you realize that something is wrong, if you have a culture in the organization where you just openly admit that's a wrong decision and you cut it off, then you add value, you integrate the goodness. But when you get an organization with a lot of egos and there is a very strong sense of authorship to the idea, then people start defending it. And then people don't want to admit that it's a mistake, in which case you perpetuate the good and the bad, and then there's no value that gets built in the company. So ability to realize mistakes when it's clear that it's a mistake. For example, you hire somebody, 2 months later, you think it's not working out. Don't keep saying, let me try him out for another year. Just fire him that day. So make decisions, but when you realize something is wrong, just cut them out. Yeah. Taking too much time?
I think that's fine.
Okay. Great.
Thank Desh again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have a special 50th lecture memento for Desh. Can I ask his batchmates to come and hand him the memento? All of you. All of you.
I'm very happy to be giving this